Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I want to talk a little bit about emotional and spiritual wellness from the lens of Carl Jung's shadow concept. I think that since the shadow is supposed to be the darker parts of ourselves, that it's really important to address that. And I came to that conclusion recently before actually reading the book when I was upset with someone and my friend was like, yeah, just turn on your read receipts. That always gets the point across. And I'm like, I can't do that. Well, I could, but when we want to be petty or we want to be, just lash out at somebody, I always say that we can't do that because it's like chocolate cake. It's going to feel really good in the moment, but I'm going to regret overindulging in that later. So in that way, I realize that whenever I'm having any dark urges, it's important to recognize them as they are and not beat myself up about it. But also, it's important to not follow through on those things, to not express the dark parts of us in ways that can harm ourselves or others. Now, similar to this concept is Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. It's like the dark side of your psyche. So according to psychologist Carl Jung, there are a couple of main parts of us, and they are the ego, and that is the part of us that we're really being most of the time. But the things in us that are dark, that we reject, or any parts of us that we reject, can be placed into the shadow. And that's really the repressed portions of ourselves that we put into our unconscious. But sometimes they will rear their heads. There's a book by Robert A. Johnson, who is also a Jungian psychologist, and it's called Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche. So I had this book on our bookshelf in our foyer, and I decided to sit down and read it yesterday. It's only like 118 pages, and the text is actually pretty large, the typeface, so it's not so bad. It's probably like a 14 to maybe even a 16 font typeface, so you don't really have to. If you can conceptualize that in like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, that's really what we're looking at. And there's a lot of space between the lines. So it's not that long even at 118 pages. But it's also a very good book. You can probably read it in a day, but it is split up into 3 parts. So you could also split it up correspondingly into a couple of days, and it has subsections too. However you enjoy reading most, go ahead and check it out. I really enjoyed this book, and it taught me a lot about the dark side of the psyche. Now, I don't necessarily agree with everything in the book, but that's okay. Not everything is going to completely resonate with all of us. There's over 7 billion people on this planet. It's just clearly not possible because we are all very much different. However, the basic concept that Robert Johnson puts across is that you can think of your ego and your shadow as being on opposite ends of a seesaw. And in the middle of that is your fulcrum, the part that it's pivoting over. And that is the balance that you're trying to perfect. Because if you are embracing your ego too much, or you're embracing your shadow too much, then you're out of balance, and that can cause some problems. Now, you might be thinking at this point, why would I want to keep my shadow balanced? That's a great question, and I totally understand where you're coming from on that. A lot of people's first impulse is to bury that shadow, but just because we feel a compulsion to confront a person about something does not mean that it is inherently negative. No traits are inherently wrong or inherently righteous, for that matter, according to this literature. So in that manner, you're trying to reintegrate the parts of your shadow that are the parts of you that you've rejected. And it's very similar to mindfulness in a way, in which you're trying to just recognize these parts of yourself as what they are without beating yourself up about it. Now, you don't necessarily have to express these dark sides of yourself, of your shadow, but you can also find alternative ways to express it. You can express it through art, or you can bleed some of it off a little bit by performing what Robert Johnson refers to as rituals. So a ritual can be anything from, just sitting down and writing for 5 minutes about what you're experiencing. I tend to do that one with journaling. I try to journal every day. I've not been doing so great at that recently, but my regular journaling is separate from my gratitude journaling. So my gratitude journaling is my ego work. That's, me cultivating the lighter parts of myself and going, hey, I have a lot to be grateful for, and I need to express that gratitude more. I need to think about it more. Whereas my regular journaling, which I have not given a name, but perhaps I should be calling it my shadow journaling, now that I have new terminology for it, is there to just get things out. So I will sit down and just start writing about whatever is bothering me at the moment, instead of just straight up going and confronting a person. Now, I'm quite comfortable with confrontation, and, that's just me, but I also recognize that it's not always so comfortable for other people. So even if someone confronts me and I'm not the initiator, I'm totally fine with it, because we all have different opinions, and it serves me as much as it serves someone else for me to hear them out with an open mind. But I get that not everybody's down for that. So instead of immediately going and confronting people, I will sit down and journal it out. And sometimes what I start journaling about turns out that is not entirely what's actually bothering me. And the focus of the writing will completely change to address something that was in my subconscious, or as they refer to it in these books, my shadow, my unconscious, the things that I've kind of repressed instead of dealing with. I found it to be very helpful for me. I set a timer for it for 20 minutes. I'm trying to reach the 20 minutes, but if you only have a limited amount of time, you can also set that as your max amount of time. You can set that timer to whatever you want it to be. I haven't decided what I'm going to do with this shadow journal by the end of the year, but I have found it to be rather cathartic, and it helps me reframe the issues that I'm facing, to integrate and accept those parts of my shadow self without beating myself up about it. My shadow journal is a place for complete honesty, even for ugly truths. And I don't share it with other people. It's just for me. So I do write it down on notebook paper instead of typing it on the computer. I also find the act of writing itself to be grounding. But you can do your shadow work in any different type of way that is most comfortable to you. Reintegration is the mindful art of recognizing it for what it is without beating yourself up about it and accepting it. It does not mean that you have to fully express it, but you can bleed it off through shadow work, such as journaling. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more about owning our own shadows.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Shadows and the concept of the shadow and how we can kind of bleed it off a little bit. So now that we know that there is light at the end of this shadowy tunnel, let's talk a little bit more about what's inside of the shadow. So when we think of a shadow, we're thinking of, the dark part of the psyche, but Robert Johnson also indicates that the shadow is not just the dark side. There are also what he calls elements of gold, or the noble parts of ourselves that we repress and don't want to acknowledge. Now, what does that mean? Why would we suppress something in ourselves that is good or noble? Well, with great power comes great responsibility. I know that's a Spider-Man quote, but it really applies here. Sometimes there are parts of ourselves that we would otherwise really aspire to be, but for some reason we feel insecure about it, and we're like, that can't be me, or we're afraid of taking on the responsibility, or we're just afraid in general of failing by trying to even aspire to that. If that feels familiar for you, that's part of your shadow work. So in that regard, a lot of people who are suppressing these noble parts of ourselves, which they argue is everyone, are really more prone to engaging in hero worship. So if you have someone who you consider to be an idol or someone you consider to be your hero, I want you to think about that person and think about what you consider in them to be the supreme ideal that you're aspiring to. And now think about parts of yourself that you can express that way. And I want you to dig deep in that. Remember, it's in your shadow. Don't just shrug it off and be like, oh, no, I could never be like them. That is another part of your shadow and your insecurity blocking your path through your shadow work. But just recognize the insecurity for what it is. Be mindful about it. Don't beat yourself up about it. And then keep digging. We want to really get in there and find those noble parts of ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge, because there is gold in your shadow too. Now, the shadow is necessary as a byproduct of our actions. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. There is a lot of scientific references in here. There's also a lot of correlates in the concept of the shadow with, anthropology. So it immediately made me think of Claude Lévi-Strauss and his concept of binary opposites and binary mediators and how they're good to think with. They help us process the things in between of a spectrum by giving us boundaries at either end. You can't understand warm or cool without knowing it's hot or cold. We'll delve into that a little bit later, but we'll reference poets as we go along. We'll reference musicians. You can find echoes of this type of concept in almost any field. It's quite remarkable how much work they've put into this. So, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So for every good thing that we do, we also produce a corresponding shadow component. A hardworking person has a shadow that wants to have fun. Someone who just has fun all the time has the shadow self that's going, hey, you should probably be at work right now. You should probably be working on something. Our goal is to find the wholeness of our personality and not just try to conform to unreasonable modes of behavior. We can't just work all the time, and we can't just play all the time. At least, not if we're not millionaires, which is most of us. So we need to be able to find something that is in the middle. And that's that balance that they're referring to. We need work and play. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. I mean, we have seen The Shining, a lot of us, I think, or at least familiar with the phrase. So we have to have both. And it's okay to embrace both. All things in moderation is really what Robert Johnson is recommending. By standing with one foot on each side of the seesaw, but right over the fulcrum, we can find that balance. But you have to embrace both your ego and your shadow to do so. Now, embracing the ego is a lot easier. In culture in general, we are taught, at least in Western culture, hey, we need to go out there and, do the good things, volunteer and be positive and all that jazz. Now, I say for Western cultures merely because I am not as familiar with Eastern cultures, so I can't really speak to that. That's a place where I need to do more research for my intellectual wellness. And that will be in a later podcast. So I'm not saying that they don't have that in Eastern cultures, merely that I am more familiar with this as Western concept for right now. So with the shadow and us producing it every time we do something positive, it's okay that that is in there. I want you guys to really accept that. I'm going to probably say that a couple times as we go along because I really want to nail it home. It is an act of mindfulness, and you can't have your ego be the sole component of yourself. Because if you're always focusing on being positive, what is going to happen when something truly overwhelmingly harmful happens in your life? Something hurtful, like when death comes. And I don't know if you've ever noticed your friends who tend to be positive all the time, if they have lost a job or someone close to them has passed away, how it can sometimes disproportionately crush them because they don't have as good of a grip on that shadow part of themselves. It's more difficult for them to sit in the sadness. And you may be that friend, and that's okay. I have lots of friends like that. And part of working on our shadow selves is also, I think, helping our friends work on it when they would like assistance. So my friend who told me to put on the reader seats, she's a real one. She's my ride or die, and I have a couple ride or die friends like that. And she also pointed out to me, at the same time that she was telling me to turn on my reader seats, hey, you can't really be mad at this person for whatever happened because you do the exact same thing to people. And I was like, oh crap, you were right. I do that. And that's also a reflection of the shadow self. If we don't own our own shadows and work on reintegrating them into our whole self, along with the ego, then we will do what they call shadow projection. We'll project our shadow onto another person. So we'll think about the things that make us unhappy about ourselves and see them in other people. And that is also what I was doing. She's not read this book. This just came to her because she is more comfortable with her shadow, I think, than I am in many ways, or at least different elements of it. And it was I'll say jarring. It was a little jarring for me, but in a good way. It was very eye-opening, I suppose is a better way to say it, where it's like, okay, I was totally projecting on this person. I read this book like a week after she and I had that conversation, and I'm like, wow, that is pretty much exactly what she was saying, is that I have a part of myself that I do not like, and that's the part of other people that really stands out to me and that bothers me. So when we're really bothered by the actions of another person, or we are upset about something someone says or does to us, we need to really think about that. Why do I not like that? Why am I judging that person for that action? And reflect it inward and go, where are the parts of me that correspond to that are causing me to really react negatively and think negatively about this other person? that was very helpful to me, and it reframed the entire problem. It's like, oh, wow, you're right. I can't really be mad at this person about this because I also do that. It's not something that's really terrible, but it is something that annoys me. And I like to follow the platinum rule, treat other people better than I like to be treated. And I get upset when people don't reflect that. But I also have to accept that not everyone is on the same path that I am or at the same place on the path if we are on the same path. And that's okay. It's more important for me to recognize the parts that are making me upset and then use that to work on my own shadow work. We're going to go on another break. When we come back, we're going to continue this conversation.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Concept of the shadow self and how we can start reintegrating it into our lives. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about in regards to the shadow self is what happens if we overindulge one side or the other. We have to balance this seesaw, and I mentioned that earlier. So if we don't balance it with equal weight on both the ego side and on the shadow side, then we lose our balance. Now that is how people end up flipping into their opposite types of behavior. So Robert Johnson gives the example of someone who is more traditional or conservative suddenly being, a lot more outgoing and throwing all caution to the wind. And that person has made a flip because they've gone too far onto the shadow side rather than being more on the ego side. We don't want to go too far in either direction. Now that concept makes me think a little bit about astrology as well. I like to be holistic in this podcast, as you guys well know. So I'm going to be addressing different elements of spirituality and emotional wellness that I might not necessarily follow as we go along, but I want it to be holistic for each of you guys. And at the very least, I want us to all learn something together. So in the concept of astrology, you have your sun sign, and that is, for me, Capricorn. So that's the one that everyone thinks of when they go, hey, what's your sign? Capricorn is me. And you have another sign called your ascending. And for me, that one is a Scorpio. So what is an ascending? That sign is pretty much just the way that you project to people on first meeting. Like if you're uncomfortable, then you are going to express more of your ascending sign than you would your natural sun sign because you're not comfortable showing someone your true self at that point. So it's very similar, I think, to the seesaw example. And for me, I am a Capricorn, so I'm very down to earth, according to astrology, and I agree with it. On that aspect, I am very down to earth. I'm a very hardworking person. But when I panic, I hit that extrovert button. I am very much an introvert. But when I am uncomfortable, I either go like dead silent and just observe everything and get super weird, or I'm going to hit that extrovert button in a panic and the Scorpio sign is going to come out. The Scorpio sign is a water sign. Scorpios are known in the zodiac for being very confrontational. They are also known for being very, they're very forthright people, and they are very blunt. So I'm already pretty blunt. You can imagine how blunt it gets at that point. It can go pretty far. And whenever you go that far, or whether that you're looking at it from the lens of astrology or from the psychological lens of the shadow or the dark part of your psyche, it's very similar. So you've gone a little bit far, and people tend to be embarrassed after they are able to step back into their ego or back into their sun sign and go, oh man, I was weird. I was very weird. I went too far. I regret some of the choices that I made. Well, here we are. So that is interesting to me, how those kind of seem to correspond, at least from my understanding of them. Robert Johnson mostly talks about it from a Judeo-Christian perspective, but it got me thinking about astrology and some other stuff as we went along, so I wanted to point out that correlate as well. Now, if we do go too far and we flip into being the opposite person of who we typically are, then we need to find a balance back into our personality. So we're just going to balance more towards the ego at that point if we've gone too far into the dark side of the psyche. He also says that the seesaw can break at the fulcrum point if it is too heavily loaded. And he refers to that as being a psychosis or like a mental breakdown. So we need to keep it totally balanced, but not try to do too much at once as well, or we will expend too much energy and essentially break the seesaw. We want to keep it, just overall balanced. That's all we're looking for is balance. And it's okay for us to go too far one way or the other. We're all learning, and part of shadow work, as they refer to it, is not beating yourself up about it. Just as we're not going to beat ourselves up about the shadow components and what we find in our shadows, we're also not going to beat ourselves up about our shadow work. It's difficult. It is going to be painful at some points, but it's important that we do it. And when we make a mistake, we're just going to correct a little bit. It's okay. But when we ignore our darkness for fear of causing an imbalance, then we're going to accumulate more of it. And then, we're going to get depressed or anxious or cause some other problems. We might lash out at people. A lot of times I think society tends to really embrace the light, almost worship it in some ways, and we completely refuse the dark. And Robert Johnson posits that when that happens, we are collectively, not just as individuals, but as a collective culture, manifesting that as war, economic chaos, intolerance towards racial issues, the LGBT community, immigration, anything. He didn't list all of those specifically. He just said racial intolerance, but there are so many different ways that we express that intolerance nowadays. That book was written, I think, in the early 1990s, and it's very interesting to me how a lot of it has not really changed. We just have redirected our aggression. And he mentions that at one point too. He mentions that, in the early 90s, we were like, oh, hey, we are done with the Cold War. Russia and the United States are going to be friends now. And after we had decided that, and, the Berlin Wall came down and everything as well, a few months after we decided there was no more Cold War, we redirected our aggression from Russia into the Persian Gulf. And later on, we redirected that towards the Middle East. And we just keep on redirecting it to different areas. And that is what he's referring to as our collective unconscious and our shadows, our collective shadows, essentially, as manifesting in a different area because we aren't individually confronting them. And that aspect, We want to make sure that we aren't projecting our shadow onto other peoples, not just other individuals, but other cultures, other groups. Because if we are projecting it that way, and the others are also projecting it that way, that is how we end up in forever wars, because we are not viewing the others as they are. I've discussed before how we tend to view ourselves and judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by our perceptions of them. And in this way, it's very similar to our shadow projections from individuals, but instead onto other groups. But if we are each demonizing each other, each group, whether that be the Russians and the United States citizens, or people in the Middle East, pick a country that we've been at war with in the last several years. You can pick ISIS, you can pick Al-Qaeda. I know those are not countries, those are particular groups, but you get where I'm going with it. Any type of grouping, whether that is ethnic, or it is an organization, or it is a country. If we are viewing each other as just explicitly thinking of them as evil, then we are projecting our shadows onto the parts of us that we don't like ourselves. We can't sit here and refer to them as being intolerant without thinking about that in our own shadows. Now, that does not mean that we should sit idly by while evil prevails. But remember that nothing is inherently evil, and we are never going to come to an understanding without considering the other side. At the very least, we will learn something when we do that. That's part of our intellectual wellness. But also, we can learn something for our emotional wellness and our spiritual wellness, particularly in our shadows. Even if we still disagree with whatever is happening, I'm not at all defending any of these groups, but I am saying that it's important for us to think about what in those groups is really bothering us, why we're thinking of them as evil others, and delve into our own shadows to find the components that are similar there. If you are mad at how they are treating certain groups, then perhaps there is a component of yourself that is biased or intolerant. It may even be towards that group themselves. Perhaps we have gone too far in identifying all people who are sharing that particular faith with the people in these groups that are harming other people. And that's going to be a bias or a dark part of the psyche that we have to confront within ourselves. And intellectual wellness and considering that can be very important for your spiritual wellness. That makes me think of General Mattis. They referred to him as the warrior monk, and he is someone I'm very interested in as just a fellow human being. He has, I believe, over 7,000 books in his library. He also was part of a scientific working group on the Middle East. He's not just a military strategist and commander. General Mattis, he's retired now, but he is also an intellect, and he really embraces that part of tactics and strategy. And I really appreciate that about him. He is against torture, not for the reasons that John McCain is against it, which is because it is inhumane, but because it scientifically, intellectually does not work. They have found in empirical studies that torturing people is not effective in getting information from them. Now, why would I bring up torture in the middle of this? Well, that is because these two men came to the same conclusion from totally different aspects. Similarly, we can all come to different conclusions from following the same paths. We can also come to the same conclusion by following different paths. And it's important that we not judge ourselves or each other on our individual paths. You are on no one's timeline but your own. Shadow work is hard, and it's okay for you to get to it in your own time. It is also okay for other people to have a disagreement with you as to what is considered to be positive in your shadow growth. That is very different for each individual. Now, just because there is a balance to be found, and there are what we consider dark components and light components, that does not mean that's going to be the same for every person. What you consider dark and what you consider light will not necessarily be the same to other people based on how they were acculturated. So that is culture and components of our traits that we acquire as we grow. They speak about that in the book as well. And it's important that instead of judging people for that when we disagree, that we get to a point where we're able to just recognize, hey, that's what they believe. That bothers me. This is why it bothers me. This is the part of myself that bothers me. Because remember what Viktor Frankl said, when we cannot change our circumstances, we must change ourselves. You may not be able to change someone else's heart or mind, but we can change how that component is viewed within ourselves. We're going to go on a break. When we come back, we are going to continue this conversation.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
We were talking about placing our shadow, i.e. projecting it, onto other groups of people and how that can lead to wars. By not doing individual shadow work, it manifests collectively in wars and economic chaos, according to Robert Johnson. So what happens if we lay our shadow onto someone else, an individual instead? He references how a lot of parents can do that to children, and that does a lot of damage to kids. And then the kid grows up having to work off their own shadow and that of their parents before they can truly become adults. And by that, he does not mean before they're 18 or anything like that. He just means adulthood in general, before they can really consider themselves adults. They have a lot of work to do. There are so many memes on the internet that say, I need an adult, not me, I'm an adult, but I need an adultier adult. I need someone who's more capable. And that may be due to people's parents laying their shadow on them. So he says that if a parent lays his shadow on a young child, that splits the personality of the child and sets the ego shadow warfare into motion. When that child grows up, he will have a large shadow to cope with, more than just the cultural shadow that all of us carry. And he will also have a tendency to visit that shadow upon his own children. So he brings that around to Judeo-Christianity and how in a certain part of the Bible it says that the sins of the father shall be visited down to the son for 3 to 4 generations. And he's likening that to the shadow, to projecting the shadow. So the parent is projecting that shadow or laying the shadow on the child, and then that child is growing up, and whether that be neglect or abuse of any form, verbal, physical, emotional, etc., it creates generations of cyclical violence unless someone does their shadow work and stops passing the buck on to kids. He says in the book as well that Harry Truman had a little plaque, I think, on his desk, and it said, "The buck stops here." So that just means we're not going to just keep passing these problems on to somebody else. We're going to stop and we're going to do the hard work and deal with it now. So in order to prevent perpetuating these cycles of generational violence, and I don't just mean physical violence, I do mean emotional, being verbally abusive towards people, being manipulative towards children, using guilt as a tactic to get children to behave. All of that is included in this generational violence. We want to think about how we were treated when we were kids and how that made us feel, and how we may be doing that to other people in our lives, particularly if we're parents, how that may be affecting our children, especially if we never dealt with it. How can you how can you really tell if you've dealt with it completely? That would be, I think, how much it still hurts. If you are still hurting a lot from things that have been done to you by your parents, then you still have some of that shadow work to do. And that's okay. It's just important that we face that and that we check in with ourselves when we're getting upset. Remember, it's like chocolate cake. If something feels good in the moment, then it might not be the best thing for us. I'm no ascetic, but I mean more like the things that we know are not great to do. So if you are going down the street and you want to wolf whistle at a stranger and you know that's probably going to be upsetting for them, don't do it. Because you feel that urge and you feel good about it, you need to think about that and why that would feel good. Is it just feeling good for you, or is that something that's going to be a positive experience for the other person as well? If it's not, don't do it. You aren't going to just stand up in the middle of a meeting when you feel the impulse to hit on a coworker. That's not appropriate. You would, if you're allowed to hit on your coworkers and you're going to do it in a respectful manner, wait till another time when you're not in the middle of a giant meeting at work and maybe talk to that person, get their consent, and give them your phone number or something. It's about resisting some of these impulses and being mindful about them. Remember, with mindfulness, we are recognizing our emotions for what they are and letting them pass through us without judgment. Similarly, in these situations, whether it's hitting on a coworker or wolf whistling at a stranger or wanting to lash out at somebody because they've made you upset, if you feel that impulse, you just need to ask yourself why. And does this need to be said? Does it need to be said now? Does it need to be said by me? And does it feel good? Does the impulse feel good because it's genuinely good? Or does it feel good because that is my shadow self just going, yeah, let's just get this out. Let's just go ahead and do it. A lot of it is just about impulse control. Now, is it possible to refuse a shadow projection from someone if they're laying it on you? Robert Johnson says yes, but only if you are already well identifying with your shadow and owning your own shadow. Usually receiving a shadow projection is going to cause a problem between your shadow and theirs. It's going to result in a fight. So he gives an example in the book where he had a friend overstay their welcome and he was trying to just be polite the whole time, and he managed to do that. But afterwards, he went to a local tree nursery to pick out some new trees he wanted to plant. And since he didn't do his shadow work before he left, he ended up picking a fight with the person who worked there for no reason, just an unsuspecting person, and he just kind of got really annoyed with them because he was already agitated, and he went off. And that is not what he wants to do. So he says that instead, if something like that happens, you have a friend overstay their welcome, then just take a few minutes before you go out. Even if it's just 5 minutes is what he recommends. He says he just sits down and he will write for 5 minutes. He may also just sit down and not write as a journal, but if you are a creative writer, go ahead and sit there and write about people who are in conflict. If you already are agitated, go ahead and get it out. He thinks that will come naturally to you if you're already upset. At least it works that way for him. So do your shadow work before you go out. I want you guys to think about the last time that you really maybe lashed out at someone who didn't necessarily deserve it. They were doing something in their own nature, or they were doing something that they are instructed to do. Like if you freaked out and asked to speak to someone's manager and it wasn't entirely warranted. And be honest with yourself about whether or not it was truly warranted, whether it was worth putting that person's job in jeopardy to get what you wanted or what you needed at the time. It's not a pretty part of ourselves, but it happens to all of us. Not necessarily in the manager context, but in general, where we lash out at someone else. That's us projecting our own shadows and laying our shadows on other people. And that means we just need to be doing our shadow work. And correspondingly, the best thing you can do when someone goes to lay their shadow on you or project their shadow on you is to just ignore it and let it pass. It is probably not even about you. It is about what they're going through. And think about the last time that you were agitated like that and why you lashed out. And understand everyone is going through something at any given point. It's probably not even about you. And don't take it personally. Just keep going. All right, we're going to go on another quick break.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about what happens when we lay our shadow on others and how to avoid confrontation by just ignoring it when someone else tries to place their shadow on us. A lot of times it can be uncomfortable, especially if you are quite comfy with confrontation like I am, to just let it slide. But it's important to keep in mind that everyone is on their own individual journeys each day, and that it's probably not even about you if someone pops off on you about something that seems totally innocuous or unrelated. Now, that's not to say that you should not take ownership of when you do mess up, but if someone is blaming you for something that is not your fault, or if someone comes home, like your partner comes home mad about something that happened at work and is just being very grumpy, don't play into it. Just let it go. They'll work it out in their own time and continue on with your day. Don't let your shadow get poked by their shadow like it's poking a bear, because that's what's going to happen if we decide to be confrontational about it. Now we're going to talk about the gold in our shadow. So remember, as I said in the first segment, we also have gold in our shadow. It's not just the parts of ourselves that we dislike that we repress, but we also tend to repress some of the hero within us. And he says that today's hero is tomorrow's character. So it's important for us to choose our heroes wisely. He says that you can view the shadow as having two components, or two shadows. One is the dark side of the ego. So that one is the one where we have positive components in our ego that we embrace, and then we have the parts that we don't like, that we repress. Now the second is what is repressed in us, but is also connected to the self, that part in the middle, the fulcrum of the seesaw. Johnson and Jung both say that getting the dark side of our shadow out is easier than pulling the good side out. It's a lot easier because our emotions are very tied to the dark side. I keep referring to it as, lashing out or laying our shadow on somebody by being mean or perpetuating any type of violence against them. That's because that is very much tied to our emotions of anger and fear and sadness and grief. If you've ever had a friend or known someone who is lashed out while grieving, that is part of that process. That's part of the shadow. And it is very difficult for us to experience, but it's easier to get out than embracing the good side of it, the noble parts of it. He also references how that is why parrots are more likely to pick up cuss words than they are any other phrases. When we start spewing cuss words, it tends to be accompanied by a lot of emotion. It's very forceful and emotive and just very expressive in general. Whereas if you're trying to teach a parrot a phrase like "Polly want a cracker," then it's not going to pick it up as much because we're not expressing it with the same amount of emotion or excitement. And the parrot picks up on that. So think about that a little bit and about how much energy and emotion and emphasis you're putting into getting upset and expressing things like that. Now, I cuss, just like a lot of people do, and recently I have noticed that when I mess something up, I'm just like, dang it, Alex, but with harsher words, in case any kids are listening, and I get mad at myself about it. But I've been trying to lessen it lately and not put as much emotion in it when I do express it. And when I do express frustration with my performance in any aspect of my life, I try not to beat myself up about it. Granted, I have a lot of shadow work to do on that, and it's a little bit slow going. That's because I'm trying to change a habit, and that can be very difficult and time-consuming. It can take a long time. That's okay. I'm not on anyone else's timeline but my own, but it is important to love the self so that we can also reflect that out towards loving others. I don't like this concept of no one's going to love you until you love yourself. I think that's not true. I have lots of friends who have loved me and stuck by me even when I was very grumpy all the time and depressed and anxious and annoying and complaining, and they still stuck through it, all of that. That doesn't mean they didn't get mad at me at certain points, and rightfully, validly so, but they still stuck around. They loved me even when I could not love myself. And so in that aspect, don't think that no one is going to love you until you can love yourself. But think of it as more of, I need to love myself because that is good for me, and then I can love others more. So we're going to promote that love within ourselves so that we can reflect it outward. And part of finding that love is reintegrating our shadow with the rest of ourselves. The good parts, the gold, and the darkness. A lot of people tend to refuse to see the goodness in them and resist it with all of our strength. That's why we do that hero worship. It's because it's easier to admire someone from afar than to become a lesser version of your ideal. In the book, Robert Johnson references Albert Schweitzer and says that that was his idol for a very long time and is still someone he very much aspires to be. But he realized that he could not be that person. He admired that Albert Schweitzer had all of these doctoral degrees in different fields and that he was a Renaissance man in that way. But also that Robert's own interests were not necessarily in exactly the same things as Schweitzer's were, and that he was trying to force himself into this mold of following these things while simultaneously being too afraid to fully commit to them because he was afraid he was going to fall short of being his ideal person, who in this case was his hero, Schweitzer, and he was participating in hero worship in that regard, and therefore stifling the noble parts of himself within his shadow. So we want to acknowledge those people, but also reflect in ourselves. Just like we're looking for the parts of ourselves that are upsetting when we are upset with someone else, it's critical for us to sit there and think about the good parts of ourselves that we might have buried. Think about our heroes and go, hey, there's that part in me too. There is a meme that goes around a lot that I see because I was an anthropology major, and you may have seen it as well. And it says that an anthropology professor told a bunch of students their first semester in his college course that they all had a little bit of wanting to save the world in them, and that's why they were there. And it's okay if they were only able to save one person, and it was okay if that person was themselves. I really enjoy that quote. And for me, memes like that, it doesn't matter to me if they're real or not. I mean, I'm very driven to find the facts and the truth, which are not always the same thing, and meaning, which again, not the same as the other two. But I also really enjoy just a good story. Just because something is not necessarily factual or truthful, even if that didn't happen, the point still stands, I think, that it is important for us to still work on ourselves. And it's okay if the only person we can save is ourselves. We tend to think of that as being selfish in some ways, but as Robert Johnson has pointed out, when we are doing that work on ourselves and we are reintegrating our shadow and thereby saving ourselves, we are halting patterns and habits of different types of violence. You may not recognize that you are having this impact on the world around you, but you are. There's one girl at the local restaurant I go to, a fast food restaurant, and one day I went through the drive-thru there, and I was just in a good mood, and it was back when I was really grumpy all the time, and I was smiling that day, and she told me that my smile made her smile. That was probably 2 years ago, and it still stuck with me. I don't know if that girl was also just having a particularly good day, or if she's just a generally positive person, or if she's done her shadow work and is thereby saving herself. But it made an impact on me, just that one sentence, years ago, and it was super small, but it mattered. So I like to also think about that internally and go, hey, what made my ego feel good about that? Let me do that for other people. So a lot of times I think in Western culture, we tend to admire things about other people and not tell them. So I like to go ahead and tell them. My favorite barista at the local Starbucks has gorgeous curly hair. So every time I go through the drive-thru, I tell him that. He does not get tired of hearing it. No one really gets tired of hearing genuine compliments. As long as they're genuine, then people will readily accept them. And it makes me smile to see him smile. So it's not any form of altruism per se, because I am getting something out of it. I'm happy because that person is happy. But it is just a kind thing to do. So I like to think about, hey, what helped me in my dark time? Okay, I don't know what other people are going through, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. So if you're eyeing a person in the store and you think that, you like her fingernails polish, or you like, her glasses or something. I like to compliment things that, people have chosen for themselves and that they have just naturally been gifted with. If someone has gorgeous eyes, I'm going to tell them. And I'm not going to do it in a creepy way, of course. It's not about attraction per se. It is just about letting them know that. Because we also don't tend to school our faces a lot. And that's why we hear a lot of people talking about resting bee face. And I don't know exactly what my face is looking like when I'm checking things out. I've been told I have a very serious face. And that's just my work face. That's my thinking face, my observant face. And I am always observing. So I want to make sure that these people don't think that I'm being mean either when I am looking at them. It's like, hey, I really like your hair. You have gorgeous curls, or you have gorgeous eyes. I love your nails. And it really perks up people's day. You might think it's going to creep them out, but that is the insecure part of your shadow going, this person is not going to appreciate a compliment from me. As long as you are being kind and your compliment is coming from a place of goodness and not a creepy place, then it's going to come across well generally. And if it doesn't, that is another person trying to lay their shadow or projecting their shadow onto you. And you just let it go. It's not about you, and that's okay. All right, we are going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about being positive and also embracing the different parts of ourselves. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the mandorla. So, what is a mandorla? I'm not just mispronouncing mandala. I hope I'm pronouncing mandorla correctly, but they are two different things. So, Robert Johnson tells us of the mandorla, and it is an old idea from medieval Christianity that is not really used much today. He says you can find it in pretty much any book on medieval theology, but we rarely talk about it at present. It looks like the almond shape in a Venn diagram, because that's exactly what it is. It's two circles overlapping, and the name mandorla comes from the Italian name for almond. So it arose back in the medieval times. I think he said like the 12th or 13th century. And when Christians were being persecuted at the time, when they would meet each other, one would draw a circle on the ground and the other one would draw an overlapping circle with it to indicate that they were both Christian and that they could speak to each other. So I thought that that was very interesting. I grew up in the church and I did not know that. So I learned a lot in that aspect as well. But it is the mandorla, that middle almond part, that is wholeness and harmony that you're trying to seek. You're trying to reunite the parts of a whole. And he also gives us the etiology of the word religion. Religion comes from Latin, and it means to bind back together. One of its roots is ligare, which means to bind together. The word ligature also means the same thing. It comes from the same Latin root. So it really means to bind back together. That's what religion means. So he says that he thinks people use the term religion incorrectly, that really it's about uniting the parts of ourselves. Many of the saints were not necessarily perfect people, but they were people who embraced their humanity along with the holy aspects of themselves. And if you are familiar with Judeo-Christianity, you'll remember that a lot of the apostles also were not perfect people. The people who Jesus was said to have hung out with were also not perfect people. They were people who were both human and who were attempting to live a life that was holy. So he's positing, Robert Johnson that is, that by overlapping these parts of the self, so those pieces that are on either side of the seesaw, the ego and the dark, the shadow, instead of viewing them as a seesaw, view them as separate parts of a Venn diagram. And instead of just what they have in common in the middle, the mandorla is instead more like an eclipse with two heavenly bodies. So like when the moon eclipses the sun, and for a little bit they are just one. So he says it starts out and it might just be a little bit of a sliver of it. Think like a crescent moon, kind of, but still almond shaped, obviously, because they're overlapping circles. So it's going to have a corresponding shape on either side. But as these start overlapping, that's you working on your shadow work. And it might only be a little bit at first, and that's okay. But over time, that mandorla is going to get larger and larger until those circles almost fully overlap. And your goal is to get them to fully overlap through reintegrating them with yourself. Remember, reintegration does not necessarily mean that you have to express these parts of yourself. You can instead bleed them off through art or through writing, stuff like that. You can use hobbies to get you through those things. Go camping if that's more of your thing, or go hiking. I like to go be in nature. That's just nice for me. And it allows me to just be with my thoughts and accept things as they are. And it reminds me that humans are animals, just like all the other animals. Indeed, in anthropology, which is the study of humans and what I went to school for, we refer to humans and animals as animals and non-human animals. So animals includes humans. Non-human animals means any animals that are not human. And it's important for us to keep that in mind because we do have animalistic components of our nature. That is why people are prone to greed or to gluttony. It is about self-preservation, which is deep down what all animals are programmed for. So we consider it a dark component of ourselves only because humans have culture and we have decided to label it as a negative trait as such. But really, it's just overexpression of self-preservation. So instead of beating yourself up for being greedy, think about how it has an adverse effect on other people and then go, hey, can I still go out here and do what I need to do to be conscious of my self-preservation, to essentially be greedy and amass as much resources as I can without harming other people? There are ways that you can do that. You just have to think about how that is impacting you personally and how it can adversely affect other people, and then find a happy medium. Robert Johnson says that it's not a compromise per se, but it is more of a balance. So viewing it as a balance is going to make it easier. Earlier, I discussed Claude Lévi-Strauss briefly and his concept of binary opposites. So Claude Lévi-Strauss says that, we have binary opposites like hot and cold, and they're good to think. And he means that they help us consider other possibilities within the spectrum. It helps us conceptualize other concepts, really, like hot and cold. You can't understand cool or tepid or warm without hot and cold. Because what is cool? Cool is between hot and cold, but closer to cold. What is warm? It is between hot and cold, but closer to warm. Those binary mediators, like warm and tepid and cool, are in the middle of that Venn diagram of hot and cold, if we're going to view it like the Venn diagram we were for Robert Johnson's work of the ego and the shadow. So they're in the mandorla of the Venn diagram. They help us have a holistic picture of the entire spectrum between hot and cold. Similarly, the ego and the shadow, when we start overlapping them, help us find the whole sense of self. That's really what's going on, is we are trying to reach a wholeness or a unity within ourselves. And that is when you're getting to a transcendent point where you're seeking enlightenment, essentially. Now, Robert Johnson argues that no one can maintain enlightenment, at least no ordinary people can maintain enlightenment, but you can obtain moments of it by doing your shadow work. But because for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, we must always be working on our shadow work. It's not a one-time deal and then we're suddenly enlightened and don't have to do any more work. Like most things in life, you have to work to obtain something, and then you also work to maintain it. Your shadow is no different. Your wholeness and your unity of self is absolutely no different. We have to keep working to reintegrate it because we also change and grow. My ex and I often refer to ourselves as, Alex, that was like 2 Alexes ago, or that was 3 Rogers ago. And for us, that really totally makes sense because it is just about how we have changed and grown as people, because we recognize that both of us have changed. We're different from who we were when we first met, and we've been different people along the way because we have grown. And sometimes we've grown together and sometimes we've grown apart. But we both recognize that in each other, that we're on these different paths, and the paths are parallel, but we're at different points and different points of time. We're not always right abreast of each other. And that's okay. It's important to let go of past versions of yourself and cultivate the person that you are trying to be now. Your priorities and yourself will change over time, But through the shadow work, you can start uniting yourself and then start trying to maintain that to be your fullest self in a healthy manner that is kind to all, including yourself, by recognizing even the darkest parts. I hope that made sense for you guys and was illuminating. I really enjoyed this book. Again, it is called Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche by Robert Johnson. I only really touched on a lot of the information that's in here. It's a very long book. I didn't even do the section on romantic love as shadow. That's the entire second chapter. I pretty much did chapters 1 and 3, which are the mandorla and the shadow itself. If you're interested in it, definitely check it out. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly. Have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.